on to their, having a feel of empowerment by belonging to a gang to this militant push, because now not only are they gangs, they are drug lords. Okay, and that happens in the 80s, and everything that you've seen has been from the 80s forward, started right then, and it was with the Contras, when they allowed the Contras to sell the cocaine in the black communities. Now that's when it started in the 80s. So this whole idea of this fix, that there was all this violence in the 1960s and violence in the 1970s, did not exist.
Yeah, that was the question.
Okay.
I was just going to remark that there's the absence of the icon of violence, state violence. Right?
Oh yeah, there is absence of it, because that wasn't. The mural was not supposed to be political. That was one of the big problems. Is like everybody was afraid the mural would be political, so I made a very big effort to keep it from being political.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Put this to rest. The community was like the village, okay? You all know about it takes a whole village to raise a child, okay? The community was like the village. Everybody there knew everybody. Everybody looked out for everybody's kids. Everybody would tell you, if I did something coming home from school, and I lived way up on North Fifth Street, and I did something way down on South Fifth Street, before I got home, everybody in my family knew that I had done something. And so consequently, there wasn't that kind of violence. They had clubs. They had clubs called the Cuddy Cuddies, and they sound like something out of the 1950s, and people used to laugh at us because it was like good night, good night, good night, good night, like Little House on the Prairie. And people said you lived out in the country in the farm fields and what have you. And it wasn't that kind of thing. It happened after World War II. There was a great migration in the Champaign. There were people who came down from the major cities, which was the gangs, people who came up from the South, who didn't know anything but rural life. They were learning something new. And then there was this little conflict that finally built up to the point where the Black Panther Society came into Champaign, thought they were going to take it over. The little country boys decided no, they were not going to take it over, and that was the violence. It was over. And they threw them out. They kicked them out.
Yeah. Kicked them out. They literally wrapped them, they literally hog-tied them, put them in the trunks of their cars, took the cars out on 57, threw them in the ditch, and left them in their cars. And they had to get back to Chicago the best way they could. So, that kind of ended that.
There's some other interesting, I'm glad you clarified that. I think particularly for young people, because there's this notion that the sort of urbanized images of African American culture, that they've always been around, and that the issues that we're contending with now have always been around. And actually, they're within my lifetime. Some people may seem like a long time, but they're very young. But you did mention Al Mitchell and Oasis Graphics, and they were around the corner from where the mural was happening.
Right.
And you talked about the sort of political movement, and that publication that they did, Common Ground, actually had a real strong anti-apartheid work. Jesse Knox is still in town. Right. Al Mitchell is still around. We might have a chance to visit with them tomorrow. But they were developing an international...
Well, they just came today because both of them assisted me on this mural.
So they were developing an international thing that's happening. And then also the psychology department that was sponsoring both the daycare program, the kids that would come to visit, and Oasis Graphics grew out of, it was community psychology, which was a new development in psychology, just about 10 years old in 78. And it sort of grew out of the sort of community mental health movement after all of these psychiatric hospitals and shelters were shutting down, and there were patients on the street, very much like sort of the Reaganomics that came in the 80s. Then this new sort of policy around doing community investment, community development work, community empowerment work, and Julian Rappaport was one of the faculty members in psychology that was sort of supporting this work, creating these resources within communities for this, this sort of different sort of political agenda that had an international component, community-based empowerment component. But I'm real glad that you clarified that history was actually quite different.
You had a question?
There's few graffiti.
That was on the wall.
People respected it.
People respected this, even as it began to deteriorate. People actually respected the wall, and there's very little graffiti that's on the wall, whereas the other wall that we had primed had tons of graffiti, and they always had to paint over it. There was no graffiti, or very little graffiti, and the graffiti that's on there now is very recent. Okay, so that, you know, but there was hardly any graffiti on the wall. And that shows the respect of the community, and actually the kids too, because the kids, it was passed down that this was theirs, you know, and like I said, it's been very recent that, you know, you begin to see the graffiti that's on there.
Yeah.
Could you say something about the Black Art Alliance that sort of had something about happening about the same time, and sort of
Well,
as a spin-off?
Kind of a Black Art Alliance. When I came back, a little bit at about the same time that I was working on the mural, a little bit afterwards, people start talking about we need to have some kind of an artist alliance, Black Artist Alliance here. So we went together and decided to form a group that was called Symmetry. Okay, and it was black artists, black visual artists, black performing artists, black dancers, black writers. And so it's like mini plays. And so we would put together these large extravaganzas that we would do, having an exhibit, a recital, dance, sometimes fashion shows, because of designers, jazz, and it would just alternate. And we had it travel so that we took it to like Danville, Decatur, Springfield, Charleston, you know, and each year we would do one. It lasted, I was with it from the time of this conception until I left to go to Chicago. And then my cousin, whose name is Barbara Stuggs, right now she is the assistant superintendent for Matson School District outside of Chicago. She continued it on for another 5 years. So it's about 10 years before it collapsed.